Well, for more on this, we're now joined by SABC News International Reporter Khayelihle Khumalo. Kay, I'm fascinated by this symposium on South Africa's global relations in a global environment. What on earth does all that mean?
Well, it's a very interesting session, Peter, especially because it was the inaugural session. So this is where the Department of International Relations and Cooperation is reaching out to the academics to revitalize South Africa's foreign policy, but also to really get to the very actual details in terms of the country's national interest. How do you pursue those interests? How do you identify that? So something that really came strong was that Africa is very central in South Africa's foreign policy. But of course, the issue of the South-South cooperation is very important by virtue of South Africa participating in structures like BRICS, IBSA, and many others as well. But they do emphasize that the North-South cooperation is still important because you look at the countries like EU in terms of their contribution to the FDIs in the country. But apart from that, something that is very important, Peter, was around some of the threats to South Africa's national interest. So the discussants or the experts, they're saying the issue of the high level unemployment in the country, the high level of corruption as well, the unregulated migration as well. So those are some of the threats that are really should be paid attention to in terms of South Africa's national interest.
All right, so just to be clear, are we talking about South Africa's national interests abroad or even domestically when we think about what's happening abroad?
So it's very wholesome. You look at the domestic issues and how do you champion the priorities of the country away, for example, the role that's played by South Africa's ambassadors, high commissioners, accredited in so many capitals. So, but also a very strong emphasis of the issue that, South Africa doesn't want to portray itself as, this power, because of, the notions, the bad connotations associated with the past regime of the apartheid, how it's terrorized the frontline states and many others as well. So it was a very significant moment as well, Peter, especially because of what's going on in Ukraine, the realignment, how South Africa is portraying this position, non-aligned, but also calling for Russia to withdraw the troops. So a very important moment as well, something that has always been raised by South Africa for the longest time, the transformation of the global institution of governance, the likes of the WTO, to make sure that the developing world is also able to gain some of the very international beneficiaries and many other aspects as well.
So who was there and were they frank with government, with the minister? Because we have been criticized on some of the positions that we've taken over time. Dalai Lama versus China, even Russia, Ukraine, that by being neutral, we've actually taken a side, some would say. Israel would say that we've taken a side. Were they frank discussions?
So there are very frank discussions about some of, the mistakes that we have seen in terms of the implementation of South Africa's foreign policy, but also something that was quite strong was that these are very complex times. These are very uncertain periods. So South Africa's diplomats should be well equipped in dealing with these issues. When you talk about the issue of security, for example, the issue of terrorism, how we've seen the rise of so many challenges, the weakness of some of the multilateral institutions, where we see the rise of unilateralism. How should South Africa respond with the array of all these issues? So I think there was a very clear understanding that, this time around, when you really make sure that you exercise your foreign policy, you should bear in mind that, these are very critical moments and requiring very extraordinary measures in how South Africa is carrying itself. For example, Dr. Pandor was talking about this strategy for Africa because we see from time to time the tension that does arise. So it does taint South Africa's image in the continent. So how does Pretoria attend to those perceptions? So there was a very clear understanding that these are very important moments to make sure that South Africa respond to this. It's well and good to say Africa is very important. It's well anchored in the foreign policy, but on the ground, what can be done to make sure that there is cohesiveness?
Did migration come up?
A very strong issue. In fact, Peter, Professor Mdletsana from the University of Johannesburg was very candid about some of the challenges, saying that this issue should be addressed, especially given the illegal migration and how we're seeing this animosity, the hostility that from time to time will arise, that the country really should not really be reactive. So there should be quite a very important proactive measures in place in dealing with this, but also important issues about South Africa's role in the continent, where to some degree, there are always these perceptions that South Africa is not as vigorous like it was back in the times with the rise of NAPERD, APRM, and many other mechanisms. So talking about how do we reinforce South Africa's prestige in the continent and beyond in terms of the participation in the international fora.
Did the minister government give any indication in terms of rationalizing some of the positions that they've taken that might have been unpopular?
I think they were very clear. For example, you go back to that very controversial decision at the United Nations Security Council where South Africa abstained with regards to the human rights violation in Burma. So Minister Pandor said that was quite disappointing. So there's a very clear understanding of some of the mishaps, some of the steps that were taken in the previous times that were very controversial. So now it's time to correct, it's time to refine, it's time to revitalize. So there's a very clear undertaking, at least from the administration. But it's a very interesting time, Peter, especially because we do know that the Secretary of State from the US will be in the country. So there's a great deal of curiosity in terms of the clarification, some of the decisions that have been taken by the US with now this bill that is before the US Congress awaiting approval from Senate, all those countries helping Russia to evade sanctions, what's going to happen. But of course, Minister Pandor emphasizing the issue of sovereignty of the African nations, but also emphasizing that South Africa will not be bullied in terms of its own foreign policy, that Pretoria will continue to do what it wants to do, based on its own national interest, based on its own rationality and many other considerations.
Did any of the neighboring states come up? Eswatini is a big story. Lesotho has had its fair share of challenges. And some might even say that the political dynamics in Zimbabwe, for example, partly explains why there is a lot of migration between the two countries.
I think it's quite interesting, Peter, because all of this just comes in the wake of the ANC policy conference. We saw from Lindiwe Zulu, the chair of the subcommittee for international relations, how she spoke about how ANC is very close to ZANU-PF, for example, talking about the stability of Zimbabwe, saying it's really in the interest of South Africa. So that issue today really did not feature prominently, but when one considers, for example, the frankness in the discussions of the ANC commissions when it comes to the international relations, it was clear that it's quite important to engage with the ZANU-PF in terms of the domestic challenges facing Zimbabwe, also with the Kingdom of Eswatini. Dr. Pandor has always been clear that South Africa is just not imposing itself, but this is for the greater good of the region, especially because when you look at some aspects of South Africa's national interest, it has to do with the stability of the SADC region, also with the strategy when it comes to economic development, emphasizing that it's quite key for the region to achieve stability so that development can flourish.
Khayelihle, let's wait and see what comes out. Maybe there might be some major shifts in policy coming out of this. But thanks so much indeed for your time.
It's a pleasure.
All right.